Thorfinn Sigurdsson, also known as Thorfinn the Mighty, was an 11th century Earl of Orkney. He was the youngest of 5 sons of Earl Sigurd Hlodvirsson and the only one resulting from Sigurd's marriage to a daughter of Malcolm II of Scotland. He ruled alone as Earl for about a third of the time that he held the title, and jointly with one or more of his brothers or with his nephew Rögnvald Brusason for the remainder. Thorfinn married Ingibiorg Finnsdottir, daughter of Finn Arnesson, Jarl of Halland, the Heimskringla of Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, and the anonymous compiler of the Orkney saga read that Thorfinn was the most powerful of all the Earls of Orkney and that he ruled substantial territories beyond the Northern Isles. A sizable part of the latter saga's account concerns his wars with a king of Scots named Jarl of Halland, whose identity is uncertain. In his later years he went on a pilgrimage to Rome, and he was instrumental in making Orkney and Shetland part of mainstream Christendom. On his death in the latter half of the 11th century he was followed as Earl by his sons Paul and Erlen. There are numerous problems associated with the chronology of Thorfinn's life in identifying his relationships to the southern polities of the Kingdom of Alba and the Kingdom of Moray. His diplomacy with the Norwegian court has also been interpreted in various ways. His life has been the subject of various works of historical fiction. Background: Thorfinn was the youngest of the 5 known sons of Earl Sigurd Hlodvirsson, but the only son of Sigurd's marriage to an unknown daughter of King Malcolm II. His elder half-brother Einar Brusi in Sémhur survived to adulthood, while another brother called Hundi died young in Norway, a hostage at the court of King Olaf Tryggvason. Earl Sigurd was killed at the Battle of Clontarf on the 23rd of April 1014. Before setting out for Ireland, he had sent Thorfinn, then aged 5, to be fostered by his maternal grandfather, the King of Scots. When the news of Sigurd's death came, Thorfinn's older half-brothers divided Orkney and Shetland between them. King Malcolm set Thorfinn up as ruler of Caithness and Sutherland, with Scots advisors to rule for him. Earl Sigurd had also been a ruler of the Southria, but these holdings appear to have escaped control of the Earls of Orkney at the time of his death, or shortly thereafter. The Orkney saga provides this description of Thorfinn. He was unusually tall and strong, an ugly-looking man with a black head of hair, sharp features, a big nose and bushy eyebrows, a forceful man, greedy for fame and fortune. He did well in battle, for he was both a good tactician and full of courage. Joint rule. With Einar and Brusi, joint earldoms were a frequent feature of the Norse earldom of Orkney, although the Orkney saga is less than explicit about how these shares were divided up geographically. Sémhur died in his bed not long after his father, most likely no later than 1018, and Einar took his share, ruling 2/3 of the earldom with the remaining third held by Brusi. Einar soon became unpopular, demanding heavy taxes and frequent military service from the farmers, and gaining little booty on his raids. He was, the saga says, a great bully, whereas Brusi was well liked by everyone. The farmers of the Isles' opposition to Einar's rule were led by Thorkel Amundsen, and, in danger of his life, he fled to Thorfinn's court in Caithness. He became his foster father, hence his by-name, Thorkel Foster. On Sémhur's death c. 1018, the disposition of his third share in Orkney and Shetland became a matter of dispute when Thorfinn claimed it as his, while Brusi was willing to grant it to him. Einar, who was ruthless and grasping, a hardened, successful fighting man, and somewhat like Thorfinn in temperament, was not. Einar and Thorfinn each began raising an army to settle matters by force, but Earl Brusi made peace between them by raising his own men to come between them and then persuading Einar to give Thorfinn what he asked for. It was also agreed that on the death of either Brusi or Einar, that the surviving brother would inherit the other's share. Thorfinn appointed Thorkel Foster as his tax-gatherer in the islands, but Einar had not forgotten their earlier dispute, and Thorkel again left the islands in fear of his life, returning to Thorfinn's base in Caithness. Thorkel then travelled to Norway with Thorfinn's support, to meet with King Olaf Haraldsson. He was well received there, for Olaf bore his own grudge against Einar for the killing of his comrade Eyvind Oxhorn some years earlier. Olaf invited Thorfinn to Norway, and he too was welcomed to Olaf's court. Thorfinn and Thorkel returned to Orkney to find Einar raising an army against them. Brusi again made peace between them, and it was agreed that Einar and Thorkel would entertain one another to a feast. In October 1020, Einar attended Thorkel's hall at Hopandanes in Dyrnes in a sour mood. On the last day of the feast, Thorkel was supposed to travel with Einar for the reciprocal event, but the former spies reported that ambushes were in place en route. Thorkel therefore delayed his departure, leaving Einar to wait for his arrival by the fire in his great hall. Thorkel arrived by stealth, walked into the hall with one of his men, and they killed Einar. Thorkel then escaped to Norway. With Brusi, the death of Einar did not end the dispute over Sumarlide's third of the islands. Brusi considered that it belonged to him, as he and Einar had agreed when Thorfinn received a third of the islands. Thorfinn thought that the islands should be divided equally. However, Thorfinn could count on the assistance of his grandfather King Malcolm, while Brusi had only the forces he could raise from his share of the islands, making any conflict a very unequal one. Brusi went to Norway to have King Olaf judge the dispute, and Thorfinn joined him there. Brusi surrendered the earldom to Olaf, who granted a third to each brother, and kept a third for himself. Thorfinn attempted to use his relationship with the King of Scots as a means to avoid acknowledging Olaf as his overlord in Orkney and Shetland, but Olaf threatened to appoint another to rule Thorfinn's share. Following Thorkel Foster's advice, Thorfinn agreed to Olaf's settlement. After Thorfinn left Norway, Olaf gave Brusi the disputed third to rule on his behalf, but kept Brusi's son Rögnvald in Norway as a hostage. These events have been dated to 1021. This arrangement lasted while Olaf was king, but in 1030 he was overthrown by the Danish king Cnut the Great at the Battle of Stiklestad. After this, Orkney was raided by Norwegians and Danes, and Brusi agreed to give the king's third to Thorfinn in return for his seeing to the defense of the islands. This agreement lasted until Brusi's death, sometime between 1030 and 1035. After that, Thorfinn was sole ruler of the Orkney earldom as a vassal of the King of Norway and Earl of Caithness, responsible to the King of Scots. War with Carl Hundason. The Orkney saga says that a dispute between Thorfinn and Carl Hundason began when the latter became King of Scots and claimed Caithness, his forces successfully moving north and basing themselves in Thurso. In the war which followed, Thorfinn defeated Carl in a sea battle off Dyrnes at the east end of the Orkney mainland. Then Carl's nephew Mutatanamudden, appointed to rule Caithness for him, was killed in Caithness by Thorkel Foster. Finally, a great battle at Torfness ended with Carl defeated and fugitive and dead. Thorfinn, the saga says, then marched south through Scotland as far as Fife, burning and plundering as he passed. Joined rule with Rögnvald. At some point around 1034, Thorfinn is said to have conquered the Hebrides, and he is likely to have been a de facto ruler of the Kingdom of the Isles, in whole or in part until his death. Thorfinn ruled alone in Orkney until the return of his nephew Rögnvald Brusason in about 1037. Rögnvald had received the favour of King Magnus the Good Olafsson, who granted him Bruce's share of the islands and the third which Olaf Haraldsson had claimed after Einar's death. Thorfinn agreed to this division, but presented the transfer of the third claimed by the Norwegian king as a gift to Rögnvald in return for aid in Thorfinn's wars in the Hebrides and the Irish Sea. King Sigtrygg Silkbeard had died c. 1036, and the kingship in Dublin had come to Ecmarcach, who was challenged by Imar Macareld and driven out in 1038. This instability in Dublin can only have helped Thorfinn and Rögnvald, who raided far and wide and established the rule over various lands around the Irish Sea. They are said to have won a major victory beside Vatsfjord, perhaps Loch Vatten on the west coast of Skye, and to have raided in England, with mixed success. In time, Thorfinn and Rögnvald fell out. The vivid account of the war between Thorfinn and Rögnvald in the Orkney saga which survives may well be only a part of a much longer saga now lost. Their enmity arose with the arrival of Calf Arnesson and his followers in Orkney. Calf was the uncle of Thorfinn's wife Ingibiorg, and he had been instrumental in the death of King Olaf. He later left Norway to escape King Magnus Olafsson. Rögnvald, with Calf's brothers, had shared Magnus's exile in Kiev and Rus under the protection of Prince Yaroslav the Wise, and the saga says that when Calf came to Ladoga to invite Magnus back to Norway, Rögnvald almost attacked him. Thorfinn found hosting Calf and his men a burden, and in time asked Rögnvald to return the third of the earldom which had once belonged to Einar I Mouth. Rögnvald refused, saying that it was for King Magnus to settle matters. Thorfinn began raising an army, and Rögnvald's islanders were unwilling to fight Thorfinn, so Rögnvald sailed to Norway where King Magnus supplied him with ships and men. He returned to the islands, facing Thorfinn and Calf Arnesson in a sea battle which Arnulf the Skald commemorated in verse. The battle went Rögnvald's way to begin with, but in the end he was defeated and forced again to seek refuge with King Magnus. King Magnus offered to fit out another expedition for Rögnvald, but he decided to take just one ship and a picked crew. He sailed to Shetland in winter, and, learning that Thorfinn was staying on a farm on the Orkney mainland with only a few men, he set out at once to attack him. Rögnvald's men surprised Thorfinn and set the farm ablaze. The saga says that Thorfinn had to break down a wall and escape, carrying his wife in his arms, flying south to Caithness for safety. Rögnvald ruled in Kirkwall over the winter, believing Thorfinn dead, but in the spring, while staying on Prepastrance, Thorfinn and his men turned the tables, taking Rögnvald by surprise, just as he had surprised Thorfinn. Rögnvald escaped the house, but was tracked down, given away by the barking of his lapdog, and killed by Thorkel Foster. The Orkney saga offers this assessment of Rögnvald. Everyone agrees that of all the Earls of Orkney he was the most popular and gifted, and his death was mourned by many. Pilgrimage. Even with Rögnvald dead, Thorfinn was not entirely secure. The saga recounts an attempt to make peace with Magnus Olafsson, who had sworn vengeance for the death of his men in Thorfinn's attack on Rögnvald. Magnus was at war with the Danish king Svein Estridsson, and died before he could take any action. Magnus's uncle and successor, Harald Hardrada, was more friendly towards Thorfinn, and made a peace, accepting Thorfinn's gifts. Thorfinn had two sons, both by his wife Ingibiorg, and unlike a number of his predecessors he appears to have married only once. Furthermore, unlike his brothers, Thorfinn had been raised as a Christian. Among the signs of the changes in Orkney society was Thorfinn's pilgrimage to Rome, which took place after his meeting with King Harald, probably beginning in 1048. The saga says that he travelled through Saxony, meeting with Emperor Henry III on the journey. It is thought that he also met with Archbishop Adalbert of Hamburg-Bremen. The Orkney saga suggests that, as a result of Thorfinn's request, the first bishop of Orkney was appointed at about this time. Named Thorolf, he may have been the same person as Rulwa, Bishop of the Isles. The original seat of the bishops of Orkney was Thorfinn's Christkirk at Bercy, where he had his residence in his later years. Death and legacy. The Orkney saga dates Thorfinn's death no more precisely than placing it towards the end of Harald Sigurdsson's reign, who died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Thorfinn was buried at the Christ Church he himself had built. He is known to history as Thorfinn the Mighty, and at his height of power, he controlled all of Orkney and Shetland, the Hebrides, Caithness and Sutherland, and his influence extended over much of the north of Scotland. The saga also makes a grander and more unlikely claim, that he controlled a total of 7 earldoms in Scotland. He was followed as Earl by his sons Paul and Erlend and his widow Ingibiorg. The Earl's mother later married Malcolm Cantmore, King of Scots. St. Olaf's saga states that following Thorfinn's decease, many of the dominions that the Earl had laid under himself were lost.